In this video, we're going to build a model of aggregate demand to understand how the money market interacts with the components of GDP. Now, what do we mean by a model of aggregate demand? A model of aggregate demand is one that would allow us to answer some of the questions that central banks or policymakers or the private sector ask when they try to think about the evolution of the economy. Now, some of these questions might have to do with policies. For example, how does the economy react to changes in central bank interest rates? Or how does the economy react to changes in exchange rates? Now, as any other model, it's going to be a simplification from reality. And as such, we're going to have to make some assumptions to make the model tractable. Now, the two assumptions that we're going to make in this particular video is first, we're going to ignore inflation. That's going to simplify the relationship between real and nominal variables because the two will be identical. For example, when it comes to interest rates, we will not make a distinction between real and nominal variables. And second, we'll just look at the case of a closed economy, so we will ignore trade flows, capital flows, or the impact of exchange rates. Now, to build our model, we start with our definition of GDP, that for a closed economy, we'll only have three components: private consumption, investment, and government consumption. Now, we simply ask the question, what are the factors or variables that affect each of these variables or each of these three components? In the case of consumption, we have income, which income, of course, is going to be equal to GDP, which we're going to denote by the letter Y. We're going to have the real interest rate, which we will denote by the letter R. And then we'll have other factors such as taxes, and of course, things like wealth of the individuals or the households. When it comes to investment will depend also on the interest rate, which we denote by R, and on other things that capture the expectations of the companies in terms of profitability and other factors that might drive investment. Now, for government consumption, we'll simply treat it as exogenously, which means we're not going to think carefully, at least at this stage, about the factors that determine the government budget. Now, we're going to write this in a very simple equation that says the GDP, or Y, is going to be equal to these three components, and each of these components is going to depend on other variables. Now, as a model, we try to understand whether we can find answers to our questions, or another way of saying it, whether we can solve the model. Now, we have two unknowns, or what we call endogenous variables. One of them is output, which we call Y, and the other is the interest rate. But we only have one equation, which means we're missing some information, or we're missing a second equation to be able to solve our model. Now, that equation that we're missing is going to come from the money market, which is going to help us understand the determination of the interest rate. Now, in the money market, we have supply and demand. Supply is determined by the central bank. Demand will be the demand for money that comes from the private sector, and we can think about this demand as depending on several variables, in particular transactions, the interest rate that wealth earns on alternative assets, either bonds or money stored in a bank. And these two variables are the ones that we're going to capture through a very simple equation that is going to say that money demand is equal, or is a function of first transactions, and transactions are going to be captured by GDP or income, Y, and then the interest rate. And in this particular case, the interest rate is going to affect money demand negatively, because higher interest rates means that the alternative return of holding money, or the return of holding alternative assets like bank accounts or bonds, which is the interest rate, is going to make money demand lower, because people will prefer to have their savings or their wealth in a bank than just keeping it as cash. Now, we have now two equations, one that comes from the components of GDP, one that comes from the money market. And simply now we have to ask the question, what do we need to solve for? What are our endogenous variables? And we have two, GDP and the interest rate. And then we have a set of exogenous variables, which is fairly large. We can think about them as taxes. We can think about them as the wealth, profitability, government spending, and a few others that we could add. Now, to solve the model, let's solve it graphically by representing those equations on a space in which we have the interest rate on the vertical axis and output or GDP on the horizontal axis. Now first, let's represent the equilibrium in the money market. And we're going to do it by picking a point in this space. Let's say a point where we know that money market is in equilibrium. So at that point, money supply is equal to money demand. And then we simply move one of the two variables. Let's say we move output. So we assume that somehow output in the economy is growing. Now, what will it take for the money market to go back to equilibrium? How should the real interest rate change so that money demand is equal to money supply? In this particular case, the real interest rate should go up so that the increased demand coming from transactions, additional transactions, is compensated by a decrease in money demand coming from the high interest rate so that we reestablish the equilibrium between money supply and money demand. Graphically, that says the equilibrium in this market can be represented by an upward sloping curve, which we're going to call the LM curve. Let's do the same thing for the second equation, which is the one that reflects the three components of GDP. As before, we start in a point that we assume is an equilibrium. At that point, the three components of GDP happen to be equal to GDP. Now, let's move one of the variables. In particular, let's in this case lower the interest rate. Now, as the interest rate goes down, we know that both consumption and investment are going to go up. So the only way to restore the equilibrium in this equation is to have a level of output which is also higher, so that output is equal to the three components of demand. Now, what we're saying in this case is that the curve that represents the equilibrium in this market is going to be downward sloping, a negative relationship between interest rates and output, and we're going to refer to this line as the IS curve. Now, to summarize, the equilibrium can be characterized by two curves, each of them representing one of the equations, the LM and the IS. And we can think about the intersection of those two curves as determining both the equilibrium level of output or GDP and the equilibrium interest rate. Now, the way the model is being used is by now thinking about exogenous changes that somehow shift one of these lines. Any shift in one of these lines will obviously lead to a different equilibrium output or an equilibrium interest rate. Now, here is a set of examples of exogenous changes that will change the equilibrium of the economy. Now, we can think about changes that will move the IS curve, and the easiest way to think about them is anything that moves the economy in a direction of higher demand for goods will shift the IS curve to the right. What are examples of changes in the demand for goods? Government spending going up, taxes going down, confidence of companies or consumptions going up, and other factors such as wealth going up could also shift the demand curve to the right, which in this case is the IS curve. Now, what could be exogenous changes that make the LM curve shift to the right? This will be changes that make the liquidity in the economy increase. Now, we can think about it in terms of supply or demand for money. If the money supply increases, we're going to have a shift to the right of the LS curve or the LM curve. We're going to have the same effect if we can come up with exogenous changes that change the money demand downwards. A very simple example is innovation in financial markets that reduce the need to hold money. So the demand for money exogenously go down. Now, these are all exogenous changes in the economy that will shift one of the curve, and then what we will see in equilibrium is a movement along the other curve that takes us to a value for the interest rate and output that restore the equilibrium between all the markets.